Shooting in low light can produce breathtaking images, but let's be honest, it can also be incredibly frustrating. Who doesn't know that sinking feeling of thinking you've captured the shot of a lifetime only for it to turn out blurry? After years of photographing in the most challenging conditions and countless more blurry images, I'll follow a few simple steps that allow me to continuously capture razor-sharp images even when it seems impossible. And after watching this video, you will also be able to do the same. I'm Wegener, and for over 20 years I've dedicated myself to capturing unique bird photos and videos and helping others just like you to create your own masterpieces. Let's take a look first what we can change on our camera bodies to get better results, and then we take a look at a few crucial steps you need to take in the field in order to be successful. And I'm sure there's a few of them you've never heard of before, but they can make a big difference. When it comes to our camera settings, there's actually just two things that we need to make sure we can achieve. Good exposure, not too bright and definitely not too dark, and also a fast enough shutter speed that allows us to freeze the action of whatever we are photographing. Now, depending on our subject, the shutter speed can vary a lot. And of course, it would be nice if we could just dial in a thousandth of a second, but that's never going to happen in a deep, dark rainforest. I'm always asking myself, what is my subject doing? And what is the minimum shutter speed I think I need to be able to get some sharp images? Now, if I'm photographing an owl and it's just sitting there for 2 hours in the tree roosting, I can have a much slower shutter speed than if I'm photographing a smaller, faster moving bird that might even be displaying. In those cases, I need to do everything I can to get a fast enough shutter speed that allows me to compensate for my sort of camera shake, but also the subject movement itself. So there's basically two safe zones I always try to get to when shooting in low light, and I rather bump up my ISO than sacrificing on the shutter speed side of things. The first one is between like 160th to 200th of a second, and the second one is a 400th of a second, where I know at a 400th of a second or beyond that, I will definitely be getting a lot of good results. What I really try to avoid is shooting below 100th of a second because I know my keeper rate will tank dramatically. I'm not saying you can't take sharp images at like a 30th or 50th of a second, and I've done that. But at the same time, in most situations, that means that you have to take like 100 photos to get one critical sharp one. And with most birds, the bird will be long gone before you actually manage to get one sharp photo. So how can we maintain a good exposure and also get to the shutter speed levels that we need? And it's pretty straightforward again, because our exposure has just three inputs: our ISO, our shutter speed, and our aperture. And in low light conditions, I always recommend something that I normally don't recommend, and that is to shoot wide open. In most scenarios, I like to stop down a little bit because it gives me increased sharpness and increased depth of field, which I like in my images. But in extreme low light situations, or basically most low light situations, we want to open up our lens so we get as much light into the lens as possible, giving us the best results in turn. Here's one important tip though when shooting wide open. And that is that you need to watch how you position yourself in relation to your subject. I like to always position myself in a way that my sensor is basically perfectly aligned with my subject or my perch, and that allows me to get the maximum depth of field on my subject. If you're not doing that, it's very likely that you will have kind of unpleasant in and out of focus areas throughout your image. And this is even more important when you're trying to photograph multiple subjects wide open. If you're perfectly aligned with your perch and there's 1, 2, 3, 4 birds on the perch, chances are all your subjects will still be nice and sharp and in focus. I follow 3 simple steps. First, I decide on my shutter speed. Do I need a 200th of a second or maybe more, depending on what my subject is doing. Then I open up my lens all the way to f4 usually. And lastly, I decide upon what ISO level I need to get a good exposure. And to determine what a good exposure is, I usually look at my histogram and make sure that I expose as far to the right as possible. So in most situations that will force me to use an ISO between like 30 to 100 and 25,600. I know that sounds scary, and there will definitely be noise in your images, but I always say a noisy image is better than a blurry image, because we can easily fix a noisy image, but we can't fix a blurry image. So with programs like DXO Pure RAW and a good editing workflow that I teach in my masterclasses, it's actually not that difficult to get fantastic results from very high ISO images, and they clean up extremely well. If you're using a mirrorless camera and you're trying to determine the correct exposure, you have to be careful that you don't only rely on your LCD screen or your electronic viewfinder, because in low light situations, these will show you a brighter picture than what it actually is. So our histogram is the best way of determining the correct exposure in these situations. It's actually quite tempting to underexpose images, especially in low light situations, because it gives us a little bit more shutter speed. But at the same time, that is a risky game, and I always recommend to make sure that we have a nice and bright exposure, especially in low light situations, because this will allow us to have the least noise in our photos. If we underexpose our images to get more shutter speed, we end up with a quite dark image that we then have to lighten in the editing process, and that in return will decrease our image quality. And here's one of my favorite tips when shooting in low light, or shooting in general really, and that is to look for a nice and bright background. If I have the choice between a dark green background and a lighter green background, I would always go for the lighter background because it shows less noise and it makes our overall exposure easier and more well balanced. One of the most underrated aspects of low light and high ISO photography is a good editing workflow. Because without that, we will simply not be able to turn low light, high ISO files into stunning looking final images. Especially in dark, flat light, it's important that we bring life back into our images and that we get rid of all the grain from the high ISO. One thing I always recommend, and not just for low light, but in general, but in low light, this enhances all the negative aspects of the image, and that is if you crop too much. Especially in low light where we're already dealing with kind of iffy image quality and maybe not 1000% sharp photo, cropping too much will definitely showcase a lot of these unwanted effects like extra grain and also that the image might not be razor sharp. And of course we also need to get rid of the noise in our images, but luckily this has actually become fairly easy and straightforward. And if you use a software like DXO Pure RAW or Adobe Enhance, which comes with Lightroom and Photoshop, you will be able to get fantastic, basically noise-free results. And here's one more step you can take if you're using Photoshop or Lightroom, and that is to go down to the detail section on the right hand side and then mask out the background from sharpening. I always recommend to do a bit of input sharpening on the photo, but I don't want to sharpen the background because if I sharpen the background, it will just increase the noise and actually sharpen the grain, making it more visible again, and we don't want that. So a great tip is to go to the details panel, hold down the optional Alt key, and then move the slider called masking to the right hand side and move it over until most of the background is black. And the black parts mean that they're now excluded from being sharpened. And of course, this and much more I show you in great detail in my Lightroom and Next Generation Photoshop Masterclasses. These classes will not only teach you to get fantastic results from your own RAW files, but also show you that editing doesn't have to be hard and you can actually enjoy the process and have fun along the way. In both classes, I teach you step by step and in easy to follow chapters the crucial steps you need to take in both programs to get fantastic results. But you won't just be watching. I'm also providing you with my own RAW file so you can edit right alongside me. And if you're not sure if my classes are worth it or the right fit for you, maybe looking at these amazing reviews I've already received from many happy customers will help you to make up your mind. So if you want to change your editing life and turn it from a frustrating chore into a rewarding experience and actually get amazing results from your own photos, make sure to check out my Lightroom and Photoshop Masterclasses down there in the description. So now that we know what to do to our camera and how to position ourselves in the field, there's a few more crucial things you can do that ensure that you will get the best possible results. And the first one is to spray and pray or just fire away. The slower the shutter speed, the more images you need to take to be able to get 1 or 2 critically sharp photos. I know this doesn't sound very sophisticated, but it's the only way to ensure that you get enough critically sharp photos. Here's one tip though, I wouldn't just hold down the shutter button and fire away continuously because sometimes that introduces extra shake into your camera. What usually works the best is to take bursts of like 20, 30, 40 images and then refocus and repress the shutter button and take another burst of images. What can also help dramatically if you're using a mirrorless camera is to make sure that your camera is either in the electronic first curtain shutter mode or the electronic shutter mode. If you're in the mechanical shutter mode, you will feel the mirror introducing extra shake into your camera, and that's not what we want in low light situations. So especially on a camera like an R7 for instance that has a very strong shutter shock, Being able to put that in the electronic shutter mode and have a much smoother experience will definitely give you more sharp and in-focus images, and it stops the camera from kind of bouncing around. If you're still shooting with the DSLR camera, there's not much you can do about it, and you have to deal with that shutter shock unless you want to use the live view on the back of the camera. Something that people don't do enough, and I talked about this in my recent autofocus video that you should check out after watching this video, is that you need to pre-focus. And pre-focusing is even more important in low light situations. Our cameras struggle when it gets dark and there's not a lot of contrast in our scene. So the more we can help the camera, the better our results will be. So whenever I'm confronted with a low light situation, I make sure that I'm basically exactly pre-focused on where I expect my animal to appear. If you're completely defocused, it will almost be impossible for your camera to find your subject in dark, low light situations. When we're photographing, there's two types of movement, one that we can influence and one that we can't. The one that we can influence is how we hold our camera and how shaky we are and what shutter mode we use, for instance, to minimize shake in the camera. And the second one is the subject movement. The subject movement we can't influence, and this is why we have to use a high enough shutter speed to be able to freeze that movement. So often in low light situations, I like to use a tripod because it helps me to stabilize the camera. Whichever way you prefer, the most important thing is that you stabilize your camera as much as possible. For instance, if you're hand holding, it's nice to have as many contacts with your body as possible. So for instance, I will push my elbow into my ribs, I hold my lens nice and tight in my left hand, and then I press the camera right up against my face, holding it very tight, and then I often also stop breathing or hold my breath for a little while, because that will also allow me to stop some of the motion that I'm making when I'm breathing. What can actually make a big difference as well on how stable your setup is and how sharp your images turn out is your tripod head. And I know in the past, especially, gimbal heads have been very popular and many people use them, but they're not the best in low light situations. And over 2 or 3 years ago now, I changed over to Flex Shooter Pro head, and that head gives me much more stable results in low light situations. Gimbal heads usually just have a little bit of movement in them, and it's quite difficult to stabilize them unless you tighten up all the knobs, but then in your situation where you can't move your lens if your subject suddenly moves. So in the end, you have to determine yourself what feels good in the field and how to stabilize your lens the best. But the more points of contact the gear has with you, the better. Like pressing it against your face, putting the arm into your chest, or resting your arm on your knee. Or for instance, you could lie down on the ground. That will usually give you a very stable base. One thing I wouldn't do though is to put my hand on top of my lens. Now, don't get me wrong, this actually will stabilize your whole setup quite well. But at the same time, in the long run, it will definitely make you miss a few photos. And the problem is that once you put your hand on top of the camera, you can't reach the manual focus ring anymore. So if your autofocus jumps off your subject, you can't rectify that. And if you're using a zoom lens, you also can't zoom in and out anymore. And it's also really awkward to move your camera and lens around if your hand is on top of the camera, and it's not a natural movement. So if your subject suddenly jumps from one branch to the other, by the time you have readjusted and put your hand in the right places again, it's probably long gone. So what I like to do instead is to have 2 fingers holding down on the base of my tripod head, and then 2 fingers are kind of clamping down on top of my lens foot. And whenever I want to stabilize my setup, I just really tighten up my grip, and that stabilizes the lens a lot, almost as good as if you had your hand on top of the lens. The big difference is though that I'm still in my normal shooting position, and if the bird moves, for instance, I can just loosen my grip and can easily move the camera around again. And if I need to tighten it down again to take a few photos at low shutter speeds, I just clamp down on my grip and get a very stable setup without having to actually move my hand up and down the camera, which in crucial situations will cost you images. And there's another tip that's floating around that has cost me many images, and so I don't really do it anymore, and that is taking safety shots. The idea is that you shoot a few images at high ISO and a high shutter speed, and once you got a nice sharp one that you're happy with, you now lower your settings to a slow shutter speed and low ISO to get much better image quality. And in theory, that's a great idea, and if your subject is static like an owl that doesn't move, this can actually work quite well. But in the field for me, this has actually always led to disaster. Because you can imagine, every time I'm lowering my settings to slow shutter speeds with a low ISO, my subject suddenly starts doing something crazy. It's yawning, it's moving, it's shaking, a second bird enters the frame. And because I'm on my better image quality settings, I actually miss the moment and only get blurry images. A fabulous example where this concept can really screw you is these beautiful birds of paradise that I've been photographing over the last few years. These birds will sometimes sit on a perch for 20-30 minutes without doing much, and because they have such dark plumage, it's very tempting trying to use low ISO and a low shutter speed to be able to get the maximum image quality and the maximum details in those black areas, because the lower ISO files have more dynamic range, so it's easier to lift them in the editing process. But the big problem is that suddenly these birds will display out of nowhere, rip their wings up for 1, 2, 3 seconds, maybe not even that long sometimes. And if you're not ready with the right settings, you will definitely be screwed out of a good photo. And this has happened to me recently with a friend in Cape York. He was shooting with a lens that was a little bit slower and he didn't want to use too high ISOs. And so he ended up with a fairly low shutter speed. And the moment the bird was displaying, he was actually experimenting with using a very low ISO and a longer shutter speed and missed out the first amazing display completely. Whereas I bit the bullet and I stayed on a very uncomfortably high ISO the whole time, being willing to give up some image quality for the perch bird, but being ready for the crucial action, and I ended up getting the shot. So I'm not against safety shots and lowering your settings to improve image quality, because I love good image quality, but at the same time it's very risky business, and I usually like to err on the side of caution and shoot at the higher ISO with the higher shutter speed to be prepared for anything that may happen. And on that note, I think it's a great time to wrap up today's video. I would love to hear from you guys. What are your biggest struggles when it comes to taking sharp images in low light? Let me know in the comments. Also give me a thumbs up for the video. Check out my channel membership, my masterclasses, and hit that subscribe button. And I will see you guys in another video very soon. Bye.